Today we will learn why you should always maintain and service weapons and ammunition properly. More about this in the report. June 5th, 2026. We are in the 5th year and on day 103 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you to the Situation Report. In today's report, we see a very interesting recording of the U-boat flotilla, which we will also take a look at. It is an open letter from Zelensky to Putin and his response to it. And of course, we will also take another look at what is happening along the front. Just briefly in advance, there have been no territorial shifts or territorial gains on either side. And we probably won't see any in the near future either because not much is happening. What we are seeing, however, are images like this one, for example. Murmansk in the Barents Sea, take a look at them. Brave men stand in front of the massive submarines that are supposed to carry Russia's naval prestige out into the world. Of course, these are all just children in uniforms, as is quite normal in Russia nowadays. After all, you have to eagerly prepare the next generation for the war, which has now dragged on for 1,562 days. But let's ignore the children and actually focus on the much more interesting thing in this picture. Both submarines have anti-drone nets. Google Maps immediately revealed to me where the naval base is located. And I was already able to spot the two submarines from the picture at the dock. From here to the Ukrainian border, it's a modest 2,000 kilometers. If the Russians are already stretching anti-drone nets over submarines here, then you can imagine what the Russians now expect from the Ukrainians. From "we'll topple the regime in 3 days" to "we're trying to protect submarines" that are 2,000 kilometers from the border from drones, and for the drone, that's also 2,000 kilometers, flying through their own airspace. Air defense routes are already a very significant development. On one hand, it shows that they assume the Ukrainians can reach and hit this target. That's why they're preparing to. And on the other hand, it also shows that they don't even trust their own air defense, which can't shoot down a drone over 2,000 kilometers away, assuming the drones are also launched from Ukraine, which should generally be the case. On the other hand, we also recently saw that the Ukrainians were able to launch the FP-1 or FP-2 drone from a truck-mounted container. So if you smuggle one of those back into Russia, then the range would be almost trivial, and anything could become a potential target. Footage shows an attack with the heavy flamethrower system TOS-1A, which, by the way, we haven't seen in a long time, where one of the rockets loses its propulsion immediately after launch and basically flies around uncontrollably. Why haven't we seen this system in a long time? Well, it has a very short range, a range of 10 to 15 kilometers depending on the projectile. And by now, that's usually within the kill zones of the front areas. That means any drone could quickly detect and attack it, and such systems are usually destroyed after a hit to the ammunition depot, which is mounted openly on the vehicle. I assume that the footage was also taken in a section of the front that isn't so heavily controlled by drones, so not one of the main hotspots. Shortly after the incident, the launch vehicle itself seems to experience temporary problems. At times, it even looks like the system is at risk of catching fire itself. Especially with the TOS-1A, that's not a small problem. These vehicles carry dozens of thermobaric rockets. If a major malfunction or a chain reaction occurs, the launcher can blow itself up, like after a drone strike, for example. But things like that can happen. It happens on both sides. Ammunition, launchers, or other systems are not always 100% reliable, but they can still be sufficient. Maintenance and care minimize the probability of errors. But both countries, and you can say that, often don't care much about inspections and maintenance. To be honest, I really don't like reporting from Kherson. Especially there, incidents have been piling up for years, which are repeatedly discussed as war crimes. So-called double tap attacks, where a target is hit and then another airstrike occurs. When rescue workers arrive, the shelling of rescue workers, attacks on UN facilities, or even recently on the UN convoy in the region. In addition, there are also regular drone attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure along the Dnipro. Here we see again targeted drone attacks on civilians who live here along the front. Unfortunately, the current incident also fits a pattern that we see all too often. A Russian drone attack hit an ambulance in Kherson. A 64-year-old paramedic and a 65-year-old driver were injured in the process. Both suffered shrapnel injuries and concussions, so Kherson is no longer just a region at the front. The city has become a place where emergency services, helpers, civilian vehicles, and residents are repeatedly targeted by attacks. That's exactly why many of these reports no longer seem like isolated incidents, but rather part of a recurring pattern that has sadly become reality here in the city, because we can see here how the drone hits the ambulance right here. The Ukrainian unmanned systems forces are once again expanding attacks on Russian logistics in the Sea of Azov on the night of the 5th. According to Ukrainian sources, 5 ships were attacked in Mariupol, Berdyansk, and in the coastal waters of the occupied southern Ukraine on June 5th. The targets were cargo ships and a tanker that were used for transport and supply tasks between the occupied ports. All 5 ships were reportedly successfully struck. This is interesting because the Ukrainian campaign against Russian logistics has now extended to almost all transport routes. Roads are monitored by medium-range drones, and vehicles are attacked. Railway connections are increasingly under pressure. And now ships in the Sea of Azov are also being targeted. Targets near Mariupol and Berdyansk play an important role for Russia in the transport of fuel. Near the occupied territories, every attack on the ships increases the effort required for Russian logistics. This forces Moscow to allocate more resources for protective measures. A few months ago, the focus was mainly on tank storage facilities and truck convoys. Now, roads, railways, ports, tankers, cargo ships, and fuel infrastructure are being attacked simultaneously, so you can always clearly see the pattern. Ukraine is not only trying to hold the front, but also to attack the entire supply chain behind it. So they are doing exactly what they announced a few days ago, and as you can see, quite successfully. Zelensky has written an unusual, direct, open letter to Putin. It's not about a ceasefire itself, but rather the fundamental question of how this war could even be ended. He first reminds that Putin has now been in power for 26 years and has spent a significant part of that time at war with Ukraine. The Ukrainian president argues that the relationship between the two countries has completely changed under Putin, where they used to talk about trade and economic cooperation. Today it's almost only about attacks, losses, and destruction. Another focus of the letter is the consequences of the war for Russia itself. Zelensky refers to Ukrainian long-range attacks, fuel problems, sanctions, economic difficulties, and the heavy Russian losses at the front. At the same time, he accuses Putin of having to constantly shift his own war goals, while Ukraine continues to resist despite all predictions. What is particularly interesting is that the letter not only receives criticism, but also includes a concrete offer. Zelensky proposes direct talks between himself and Putin, accompanied by a complete ceasefire for the duration of the negotiations. He also mentions an exchange, namely of all prisoners, as well as international security guarantees involving Europe and the USA, as a possible basis for a peace process. His central argument is that today's front line must be the starting point for diplomacy, not endless working groups or new Minsk agreements, but direct political decisions at the highest level. Exactly this offer has now been rejected by Putin, who would have thought. And from the Ukrainian perspective, this makes it very clear what is currently causing possible peace talks to fail. The letter includes many political messages, some likely to be seen as provocative in Moscow. At the same time, there is a concrete proposal for talks, a ceasefire, and a prisoner exchange on the table. And the talks are meant to be direct talks, not talks through representatives. But the Russian response was not a counter-proposal, it was a rejection. This leaves the impression that the Kremlin still relies on achieving its goals militarily instead of choosing the path of direct negotiations. For Kiev itself, this is another argument for the thesis that this war continues not because no one wants to talk, but because Moscow wants to continue it. The timing is, well, how should I put it, not chosen by chance, in my opinion, because the Ukrainians have been putting extreme pressure along the Russian supply lines for days and are showing what they are capable of. Then they try to show with a public letter that they are ready to talk and that they could end all of this now, and that is rejected. It is possible that the Ukrainians will now escalate further and target other prestigious objectives, such as the Kerch Bridge, for example, because the Kerch Bridge is becoming increasingly interesting as the supply situation in Crimea is currently very threatened. Let's stay with the southern supply route for now. The losses are now as high as they have been in recent days. We have well over 300 vehicles in total that have been destroyed here, most of them along the supply route. What can you do about that? Well, you could improve air defense, deploy more soldiers, or develop countermeasures. All three would be good ideas. The Russians have now started setting up dummy targets. The idea is that a Ukrainian drone pilot will assume there's a real vehicle there, even though it's just a decoy. Here they've even placed a dummy underneath to make it look like someone is repairing a car. I'm telling you, the Russians have always been extremely creative when it comes to improvisation. And with that, I want to thank all subscribers, channel members, and the Old Algae crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Rennica, Stiller, Dittrich, Freddy, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, and comment. See you in the next Situation Report.